Hello everyone, welcome to Theory of Architecture. On a slight note, just before we start this podcast, this conversation was recorded before the sad death of Christopher Alexander. He was an influential figure in the world of architecture, and his writings have been read by many hundreds of students, probably thousands over the years. I'd encourage you to go and read his books, especially A Pattern Language. It is in that context that Nikos and I had this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, well, Nikos, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. It's great to finally have you on.
It's a pleasure, Bruce.
And I first encountered your work with your book, which I did a previous video on, which I also have here, Theory of Architecture, among one of your many books, of course. And I'm sure we can talk about some of the other ones as well, including the one that you sent me, which was the new pattern language for growing regions.
Yes.
Which I'm sorry to say I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I have flicked through it and read little bits of it, and it does look very good.
Oh, Bruce, I'm terribly disappointed in you.
I have lots of books to read, so it's I barely get time to read anything these days with everything going on. But yes, what really struck me particularly a Theory of Architecture is just how much it delves into the sort of the scientific and the mathematical side of architectural theory, and then takes those principles and applies them to sort of practical rules of architecture as to how to design structural elements, formal elements, systemic elements, those kind of things within a building. So how did you get to the theory as it is? And your sort of general theory of architecture, and what's your sort of background that has led you to the position of what that theory has become?
Well, Bruce, thank you for a very precise summary of what my book, A Theory of Architecture, contains, namely the scientific derivation of certain rules for design. And design has to be defined as a user-friendly design, because the term design means very different things in the profession. The type of design that I'm interested in is the organization of matter, spaces, surfaces, structures that help human beings, that help human health, help human physiological health, and help human psychological health. So this is very specific. If you go to many of our architecture schools, design has a totally different meaning, as you very well know. Design could be a very interesting and pretty graphic on a computer screen. Well, to me, that raises red flags. Namely, it could be built as a building that is wonderful, or that is totally ignorable, or that causes harm to the health of the people who have to enter it or pass by it or live in it and work in it. So to me, this is facing this dilemma. When I became interested in architecture, this was an unacceptable state of affairs. So I felt that it was my duty to derive a theory of architecture that will give useful and practical rules for design.
Mm. And your background is sort of from a mathematical background, isn't it? So that's how does that feed into the theory?
Well, I'm a mathematical physicist. I have a PhD in mathematical physics. My training in architecture comes strictly from my 30-year contact with Christopher Alexander. So he is sort of my guru. I learned as an apprentice, not actually doing buildings, but helping him on his edit his book, The Nature of Order. So that's where my architectural training comes from. And of course, as you well know, Alexander has focused all his career on on improving the well-being of the user of a building. And since the 60s, when he was a young professional entering the field of architecture, he totally rejected the abstraction of design that everyone was taken up with and fascinated with, and which is still occurring in the field today. So you said very kind things about my book and my work. All of my work is really based and inspired by Christopher. And it was meant as a complement to his voluminous and profound work on giving rules for designing very healthy human environments. He spent his entire professional life doing that. And when I started to work with him on editing The Nature of Order, I realized that there was this giant void in the profession, namely, there was a big blank where theory of architecture was supposed to be. And I know this is controversial, but that was my assessment. And I thought, well, Christopher is working feverishly over decades to fill in this huge blank that professional architects don't seem to realize is a blank. And I can fill in some pieces. So, I can try to fill in pieces that Christopher is not filling in, because there's a lot of work to do, immense amount of work to do, and there still is.
Yeah, well, I think my impression of Christopher Alexander's work, I mean, I've only read A Pattern Language. I haven't read the whole sort of series, but it seemed, and it was interesting to me that it was on my undergraduate reading list, albeit at the bottom after all of the sort of typical modernist books. I think the value, there's a lot of value in it, but for me, it made too many mistakes and missed the underlying theory, the underlying sort of justifications for why it was saying what it was saying. Maybe that was in the other books and I missed it. But your work seems to provide that underlying theoretical basis for a lot of the conclusions and the patterns, in the sense of the pattern language, that Alexander developed. And I think that it's almost, there's been so much pushback from, especially from the sort of modernist architectural side against Alexander's work, that it almost needs like a reset, like a theoretical reset. It's kind of the same with the Prince of Wales's stuff. Like, he's so maligned, and it's so sort of taboo to talk about anything that he has said, or whether or not there's value in some of the things he said and where he's got things wrong and that kind of thing. That you almost need to take a more objective look. And I think what your work, for me at least, does is it sets out some sort of the rules which you can follow and the principles that you follow, which can lead you to different conclusions. And they might be different conclusions from things that Alexander said, or even specific things that you've said. But if you're following the same principles, you're going to lead to better results overall than if you're following either no principles or misguided principles that come from other sort of architectural theories.
There's enough in what you just said to occupy us for 3 hours talking. Let me make a few points. First of all, you cannot judge Christopher's oeuvre just by the pattern language. The pattern language is 1977. Okay, I helped him to edit The Nature of Order, which is 4 volumes, about 2,500 pages, and those were published in 2001 to 2005. You cannot judge Christopher's work just by the pattern language. You really need to read all of The Nature of Order. You were kind enough to say that you found my own contributions valuable and practical. Well, I come back to the fact that my own work was extremely strongly influenced by Christopher's work and the pattern language, because I helped him to edit it. And and this was a 25-year task for me. While helping him to edit his book, I did not write part of the book. He wrote the book, but helping him to edit it, to bring out his own ideas, I got a large number of my own ideas, and those are what I turn into my own writings and theories. And as such, they're supposed to complement and boost Christopher's own conclusions. As I said, I feel that my contributions are filling in the blanks of architectural theory, where there's a total waste. There has been a total wasteland for about a century. Christopher has filled some of that, and I'm filling out parts of it. And there is no contradiction between what Christopher says and what I say. I think 99% is complements each other. We fill out little pieces, and I think that I can give some arguments where Christopher's argument is weak, and where Christopher's argument is strong, I use his own arguments. So that is my perception of the field. Now, another point that needs to be made is that I did not stop with the theory of architecture. I have been just writing as fast as I can type, and as fast as I can get collaborators to write joint papers. And phenomenal things have happened in the past 20 years since The Nature of Order has appeared. Because poor Christopher, since his stroke, has been unable to work for the last 15 years. So he has not been able to profit from all the new medical data that has come in. That has shown that his intuitions and preliminary conclusions in The Nature of Order turn out to be mostly correct. You know, an astonishing validation of his intuition. That material now is available because there is a group of researchers some of whom I collaborate with. We have been writing scientific articles about how the latest medical research and psychological research impacts on the design and on the neurological feedback on the human body. So this is very recent work, and that also contributes to fill in the wasteland of architectural theory.
Yeah, you say in A Theory of Architecture, something that I thought of for a long time, which is that there's not really a scientific culture or a peer review culture within architecture. And that there's no feedback loop in people looking for evidence as to what makes good architecture, what performs well in terms of its sort of function, practically, but mainly psychologically. And therefore, there's no sort of obvious way for architects to say, okay, well, that building didn't perform the way it was meant to, that one performed better, what's the common factor, what's the variables. The sort of the normal scientific process just doesn't really exist within architecture, kind of understandably, because frankly, we're all artists rather than scientists, which I'm trying to change, and I'm trying to encourage people to be more scientific in their thinking. But that, as you say, that's what's always been missing, is that evidence base of, if you do this, then the outcomes, psychologically, well-being, urban development, I don't know, crime, any variable you want to pick, are better. And that's the evidence base that I would really love people to sort of engage with, and to actually look at, and to think, what actually are the practical things that I can do that have measurable causal effects on people's well-being and on the ground.
You expressed a very nice wish, but I think that you are being too optimistic. The reason is that there is every indication that evidence base was thrown out of architecture, starting from the Bauhaus, and it was replaced by a cult-like adherence to certain visual typologies. So every time anyone has tried to introduce evidence-based into architecture, it doesn't work. It repels, just like the duck repels water from its feathers. Contemporary architecture for the last 100 years is designed to repel evidence-based. data.
Why do you think that is?
Because of the way contemporary architecture was set up in the 1920s. It went against the evidence because the typologies introduced by the Bauhaus really create anxiety. So as soon as you allow evidence-based, the first result, it tells you this architecture is bad for human health. So you cannot possibly allow it. It threatens with the entire system with collapse. Therefore, it has to be excluded, and it is excluded by using the power structure of the system, and it is a tremendously powerful system because of the money it has made. But the money that the system has made has nothing to do with the health of the users. It has been at the expense of the users. The building typologies of modernism right through deconstructivism are wonderful money makers for the building and construction and engineering industries and the materials industries. So all of that, we're talking about trillion-dollar industries that are making a lot of money. This has nothing to do, and it was the health of the users was never a concern, even today. There's a lot of talk about the health of the user. Oh, that is really public relations and ultimately dishonest. Architecture of the last century has never tried to adapt to the health of the users, with the possible exception of letting in more light as compared to 19th century, very dark and ultimately unhealthy interiors. So letting in more light has some salutogenic properties because there are some antiseptic qualities to having more light. But aside from that, which is just one positive point, everything else has been negative.
So in terms of exactly where those financial interests are, do you mean in terms of the founders of the movement and their sort of the basis of their sort of intellectual basis and any monetary value they have from that? Or do you mean things like the actual construction cost of, sort of, I guess, more modernist, minimalist typologies being often lower by design than less minimalist typologies, and therefore that being a sort of ongoing financial interest for construction companies and developers?
Well, I mean both. Let's take present day. You have global construction that has a certain way of doing things. It is a status quo. It is an architecture industrial complex that has its methods of building glass and steel skyscrapers and a lot of poured concrete. The concretization of buildings is making a lot of money. There is no need to change anything. In fact, any thought of perturbing the system is a threat to the immense profits that it is making. When someone like me or my friends claims that the product, the actual built product, is unhealthy for users, psychologically unhealthy, well, it's a threat to the profit, because you have a machine that is working to produce an immense volume of built fabric all over the world. And it's a machine that is working very well and efficiently according to the profit motive. And there are many interlinked industries. The materials, producing the steel, or producing the plate glass, or the concrete, tearing up mountains in order to make concrete. So, why change a profitable system? Just because some peripheral people say it's not healthy. Well, who cares? Who cares about the residents of these giant skyscrapers, in China or in anywhere in the world?
Yeah, what is the solution to it then? A more regulatory one, whereby and this is the route that the government in the UK here seems to be going down with its latest changes in our planning system, or proposed changes. Is it a thing that ultimately has to be mandated by by governance structures, whether that's local or national governments, or is it something that can be marketized? Like, is it possible to marketize architecture of the sort that would be good for human health?
Well, being an American, I'm more of a free market capitalist, and I have my hopes in the market driving humane architecture. But it may be a vain hope. Now, the other possibility you mentioned is the status solution, regulations. It looks good on paper, but wherever I see such regulations applied, there's always corruption and ways to get around them. The worst and the most egregious mistakes are made in places where existing legislation really tries to protect the user, and those are totally flaunted, either by clever lawyers going around, or in other countries, a suitcase full of cash, and forget all the well thought out legislation. It just goes out the window.
Yeah, well, I think at least in the UK, we're lucky that we have very low levels of corruption generally. At least probably in the building industry as much as in any other industries.
Bruce, I totally disagree with you. The destruction of the British architectural heritage occurred through corruption.
In what sense?
In the 70s, people were paid off, and suitcases full of money, pounds in this case, were distributed to politicians by construction companies and by architects. I mentioned that in my recent article just a few weeks ago in The Critic, looking at the root causes of the architectural destruction of British heritage in cities. It was just driven by corruption. And several people went to jail in the 1970s, but unfortunately not enough, because 2 or 3 people went to jail, politicians and architects, but many, many others did the same destruction all over the UK and lived very happily with a large bank account.
Mm. Well, to bring in back my optimistic note, it does seem to me that there is beginning to be a move against some of the more negative aspects of late 20th century architecture, such as concrete is now falling out of favor, largely on sustainability grounds. Timber framing is becoming more popular, mostly to do with glulam. And as you say, daylight's always been a popular thing, and urban greening in particular, which is a particular interest of mine around biophilic design and sort of not biomimicry, but biointegration, I suppose. Those things seem to be becoming more popular, and there's more of an interest in them generally. So do you think we are at the beginning of a turning point where people are starting to value especially more sustainable architecture, whether it's sustainable psychologically or to do with carbon and the environment and nature? Are we at the beginning of that turning point, do you think?
I'm afraid I don't think so. The same guilty people who created inhumane environments have caught on to buzzwords in order to continue their hegemony on the construction industry. So they are stealing what my friends and I published as biophilic design, twisting it in a perverse way in order to continue to create inhumane environments. You say wood is in favor. Yes, but I see wood being used in the most perverse, inhumane way. Wood is the most beautiful material, and yet it is used in a perverse way because there is a perverse continuation of certain design. Those design images coming back from the 1920s, they're inhuman. And it doesn't matter if you use concrete or wood. Wood just makes it slightly better. It improves it by 5%. But the basic idea of the shapes and the surfaces and the volumes, the basic idea is screwed up. As Christopher Alexander pointed out in his famous debate with Peter Eisenman. the entire way of thinking of architecture students for decades, for generations, is screwed up. I mean, their brain is rewired in order to regurgitate these inhumane images and spaces and surfaces. What you are mentioning are positive signals, but they're not going to make more than 5% change for the better. What is needed is for architects and architecture students to learn about what adaptive humane architecture is really about.
Well, that's certainly why I'd recommend everyone, all architecture students, to read your book and books, and learn those things in particular. And most importantly, I think, to understand the theory at the basis of why they should do certain things, not just saying churn out this form or that design or this design, but actually why it is that they make certain choices as to what forms they're going to create, what layouts they're going to create, what sort of their aesthetics will be. So moving on into that a bit more, there's a lot of talk, especially in the UK, in the government, about the word beauty, which has been regurgitated since being sort of banned from talking about for about 30 years, probably. There's still a sort of recoil whenever you mention the word beauty, and especially to other architects, as if it's this sort of horrible concept that you can't possibly touch, because it's all very twee and it's all very like kitsch and very unfashionable. What does beauty mean to you on a sort of theoretical level and a sort of practical level?
Beauty is a dangerous word because of its marginalization by the architecture profession and by the art profession. It started from the art industry that sold the most repellent, disgusting, inhumane products and label them beautiful. So that was, after a few decades, then the word beauty has no meaning, because you have sabotaged the word beauty by using its opposite in order to undo what beauty originally meant. Now, if you want to use beauty in its original sense, it means something that affects your body biologically. Certain experiences, neurological experiences, have a positive effect on the body, and those are salutogenic in the long term. They are healing in the long term. So we can classify beauty as the quest for being surrounded with environments, objects, colors, spaces, geometrical configurations that produce a healing effect on the body. That is the definition that my friends and I use, but of course it's not the universal definition, because then you ask someone, a contemporary artist, is this beautiful? They say, no, this is not beautiful. This is ugly because this is old-fashioned. What is beautiful is this. And then you look at something that creates horror, and it raises your blood pressure, and it dilates, it constricts your pupils, and it raises the skin conductivity. You know, all these are body signals of fight or flight. These are stress generated. These are objects that generate stress, that are bad for your body and therefore bad for your health in the long term. So to mislabel something as beautiful that creates this reaction is a total fraud, and people don't realize it. So, I mean, you know, this is not a good explanation, but we cannot talk about beauty when you have something that is good for the body labeled as beautiful, and the diametrically opposite thing that it creates harm to the body in the long term also labeled as beautiful by a certain part of the population. And the media, of course, is totally complicit in this confusion, and continues to confuse the public. The public is just totally bewildered because they see the media and they see something that's totally repellent labeled as beautiful. Well, what are they to make of it? You know, their own gut feeling, their visceral feeling is very old-fashioned. They say, this is beautiful. You know, a baby is beautiful. It creates this warm feeling in me. I love a baby, not only my own baby, but anybody's baby, it creates this neurological, a positive neurological reaction. It's the reason we devote energy and effort in order to raise our children, because we love them, okay? And it's the reason we fall in love with someone, because we look at them and we attach to them. We see that they're beautiful, okay? Maybe it's not the most beautiful person in the world, but we attach to something that we consider beautiful. And then if we get married, we devote the rest of our life and go through problems of keeping the marriage because of some dimension of beauty. Now, when you have the architectural establishment telling you that some horrible anxiety-inducing building is beautiful, everything is confused. We don't know what to believe anymore.
Yeah, well, it amazes me that given how much focus there is on mental health now, quite rightly, the sort of the aesthetic wellness and the effect that the built environment has on mental health has not even been touched on by sort of mental health advocates or organizations. Like, it's completely glossed over. But the amount of effect that it has, and I'm sure there's, as you said before, there's increasing evidence on these things because people are actually starting to do the studies on them. The effect that the built environment has on people's mental health and how they feel on a day-to-day basis, especially given the increasing urbanization of our population, that is just absolutely massive. So why is it that, given that no one seems to have latched onto that idea and focused on the built environment as a device for improving people's mental health?
Well, Bruce, here you need to be very specific about when you say, why has no one? There is a fairly sizable group of researchers, myself included, who are publishing furiously results that show what type of environment is good for our mental health and for our physical health. So it's not that we are just sitting and doing nothing. The information is being published. We are collecting results. Some of us are actual neuroscientists, medical doctors who are doing research experiments, and we are connecting this. We're writing review articles in architectural language. So everything is available. Now, the public, of course, is immune to all of this. The public needs to have some spokespeople alert the public, listen, this is very important. It's here. The evidence is here. These people are talking about it. Well, the media has totally failed in its supposed role of being a watchdog, because it's not informing the public. And on the other hand, the architectural industrial complex would like to bury all of this information. I mean, they read this information. I know this from my colleagues, on the other side of the divide. They read so as to pick up an occasional thing, an occasional result that they can twist, misuse in order to continue their hegemony of the and dominance of the field. So they're not interested in science. The architectural establishment is totally uninterested in science. And anyway, they wouldn't know science if you hit them on the head, but they can recognize technology. So they can recognize a technological tool that they can abuse in order to further the power of the system and continue the status quo. So I'm afraid that's what is happening. And the situation I just described is fairly bleak. So it may help to answer your question of why isn't anything happening? Well, these are some reasons.
Yeah, no, I definitely share your frustration at the general architectural establishment's unwillingness to be in any way scientific or get involved in scientific papers and reading science and actually understanding causal mechanisms properly. One interesting part of this in the UK is part of the reforms that our government is currently proposing include a proposal for local authorities or local governments to have to produce design guides, which our planning system would be subject to. And there will be like a national design guide that will be a guide to the guides, effectively. And exactly how that feeds in, because it will ultimately be decided by, I suppose, by elected officials or by members of the public or design review panels, or certainly have more of a public feedback. I'm hoping you might start to get those general members of the public, your Joe Blogs and Joe Average on the street, saying, hang on, that's really ugly. That's really beautiful. We want our local area to have lots of beautiful buildings in it. We're going to put it in the design guide that says you have to do X, Y, and Z, and you can't do these other things. And hopefully that will provide a feedback mechanism that will enable or encourage, or I suppose even require beauty as defined by those people to exist to a greater extent, and to not be caught up in sort of ugly structures and ugly buildings defined by people who define them that way.
There is a bright hope for the UK, and that's in my friend Nicholas Boyce Smith, who is spearheading a movement, very, very practical, down-to-earth movement, which is good, on improving the quality of the built environment through very practical ways, through incentives, through developers. This is where it starts, and through information that's given in a digestible form to local councils so they can make an informed decision. So I have hope. If anything is going to change, I have hope in Nicholas, who worked with the late Sir Roger Scruton. And Sir Roger Scruton was, of course, vilified and totally marginalized. Now, he happened to be a conservative philosopher, but his assessment of beauty and ugliness in the environment really had nothing to do with his conservative part of the philosophy. It's common to everyone, because these are biological, common biological responses of all the population, all ordinary people who had not had an educational imprinting to change their natural emotional response to forms. But look what happened. Poor Sir Roger, just before he died, he was tricked, and his career was made. It was a terrible thing to do to a great philosopher, even if you did not agree with his conservative viewpoints. He was a great philosopher, and he spoke for a large number of people across the political spectrum.
Yeah, well, the sort of political tie-ins of this have always been interesting to me, because I've see it almost more as a left-wing issue. Just because you think of like Morris and Ruskin back in the early 20th century, they were very much men of the left who were promoting sort of beauty and craftsmanship and the sort of the old world and the sort of the culture of craft and that kind of thing. And there's always this tie-in now between traditionalism and traditionalists and conservatism. And I don't think that's a fair tie-up, because it's the architectural establishment tends to, and I get this from most of my architectural friends as well, they dismiss people who don't follow the norm, or who look to the past for inspiration or sort of theoretical justifications as traditionalists, and you can just dismiss them for being traditionalists. And I also don't think that the traditionalists help themselves or help the cause, often by going full hog into traditionalism. Like there's a sort of subset of architects who only do traditional buildings, are very open about the fact they only do traditional buildings, whether that's neoclassicism or whatever else, and don't try and find a midpoint. And therefore there's this idea that's sort of come up that either you go all the way one way or you go all the way the other way. Either you're completely a traditionalist or you're completely a modernist, and there's no possibility of any cross blending or any in between. And I hope that people can see that that's not the case, and that if you follow the right principles, as in similar to the principles that you lay out in your book, that you can end up with a form of architecture that is not traditionalist, that is not modernist, but is something that's completely new and very, very good for people's well-being.
Again, Bruce, what you just said, we could argue about for 3 hours. Let me try to address a few points. First of all, is the great deception, which is just a power play in order to maintain the status quo and to keep the system alive, which is a very bad system producing very poor architecture. That ploy is to immediately polarize things according to politics. Good architecture has nothing to do with politics. Either left or right. I have friends on the left and on the middle and on the right who want wonderful, humane architecture. The political orientation has nothing to do with it. However, if you brand good architecture as either left or right, then you can attack it. And that's exactly what the system does, because they want to destroy it, because it is a threat. It threatens the inhumane establishment status quo architecture that is prevalent all over the world. The star architects create this inhumane architecture, and therefore the star architects want to attack this as traditional or leftist. I have some friends who say, well, it's all this is communist, but it's not. You can tag something in order to attack it. That is unethical, but very effective. So we have to get around that. It's very difficult to get around it, because once you tag something as political, either on the left or on the right, and then you start attacking it, then everyone's blood gets very hot, and it's impossible to use reason. That's why in all this enormous volume of writings that my friends and I have presented, you will never see any political illusion, because there is none. This is science. It has to do with the human body and the society. Okay, it has nothing to do with politics. It is difficult to get around this. Only education will help, but education has totally failed, because there are these trigger signals. The trigger signals, well, let me get to this to the dichotomy that you mentioned earlier of the great lie that something has to be either very traditional or modernist. That's a big lie, but that's very it is convenient for the modernists to say, well, either you hire a very traditionalist architect who does classical architecture, and there are some of the finest practitioners in the world happen to be British, okay, and you can hire them to do a wonderful classical building, which happens to be very humane. So that's one solution, but it's not the only solution. Alexander's school of architecture has no columns and pediments. It does not look traditional. However, it looks and feels old-fashioned. So this is even more important. When you create a healing environment from materials, a building or an urban space, it feels old-fashioned. That feeling is what your body is telling you, that you are connected to it biologically. Now, the modernists and the contemporary architects want to avoid any of that old-fashioned feeling, because they want to avoid the neurological connection. They are seeking an anxiety feedback from the structures. You can grab a star architect and squeeze him or her, and you will never get them to actually admit to this. But what they want is the anxiety feedback, to make people feel anxious. That is the goal of their designs.
Do you think they're consciously doing that, though, or is it just a result of something else?
It's the result of training to create anxiety-inducing architecture straight from day one of architecture school, where they were conditioned, like the Pavlovian dogs were conditioned From the very first class, they were shown pictures on the screen. This is good architecture. Well, this happens to be anxiety inducing. So they go for 4 or 5 years seeing all the stuff, and then they learn to create anxiety inducing architecture. And you have someone like me telling them, what every single building you've designed creates anxiety. Well, they totally dismiss what we are saying. You show them the medical data, you show them the EEGs. We don't care about that. We're famous star architects. We make a lot of money. We get paid by governments and by private corporations to make big buildings. You are as insignificant as insects. We don't care what you say. We have the power. We don't have to pay attention to what you say. But
they are beholden. Even the star architects are beholden to clients ultimately, because most of them aren't developers. So is there a role for the big developers of the world and the big clients to say, we're not going to stand for this anymore, we want something better? Or are they just not incentivized to do that for financial reasons or any other reason?
Clients, the big clients, have no incentive to pay attention to what we are saying, because the big client gets seduced into the power game. The big client wants their name. The big client wants to get the best available, the most flashy star architect. They're not going to commission a very modest architect who will say, listen, I will create a modest building that is good for the users, that people will actually feel good working in this building, that will have a far lower sick percentage of absentee workers. Clients don't care about that. Clients get seduced by just brute raw power. They say, we want our building to stand, to be shown in the web zines of architecture, and to look like something that is really striking and new and powerful, and we want to express our power. When you try to express power, then you get into the part of the brain that goes back to the predatory and the aggressor. Something that feels nice does not express power. Something that creates anxiety expresses power. Okay, we have that part of our brain. We are predators. Okay, for millions of years, we walked around and we hunted animals. You cannot kill an animal unless you have that predatory part of the circuits in the brain. Well, those are the ones that are triggered today by the star architects to create their inhuman designs, and they're triggered in the client. The client says, I have this billion-dollar corporation and I want the headquarters to really show power. And I'm not going to have a modest looking building. It doesn't show power. I want a building that really looks like, well, it exerts power on the people.
It always struck me that felt like a continuation of the artistic avant-garde with like Duchamp's Urinal and that kind of thing, where you have shock value. And I think you're right. The thing about power is very prescient as well. I remember hearing a conversation with the developer of the Shard, who was basically saying, I want to build the tallest building in London and I want it to be big and bold and striking. And beauty doesn't even come into it, or sort of, I remember the first time I stood at the base of the Shard in the public realm around there and thinking how unbelievably awful it was. And it's difficult to sort of, I suppose, get people out of that mindset, because as you say, they're not incentivized. You're right. They're incentivized to have the big shiny building that gets on the internet and people share pictures of it, and they can say to their board members, look at our shiny building, isn't it nice? And that's sort of, there's a lack of humility, if you will, in the commissioning of those sorts of buildings.
My dear Bruce, the whole point is the opposite of humility. The whole point is to be a sadistic psychopath as much as possible, to have a building that expresses this sadistic power. And you see the success of this. This is a ploy that's highly successful, because when a corporation now wants to hire an architect to build their headquarters, again, they will not go to someone who will promise them a modest, humane building. They will go to one of the star architects who has a track record of creating sadistically oppressive buildings that show this raw power. And you mentioned some buildings. Okay, so have these architects been disqualified because of the monstrous, inhumane structures that they have erected? No, they made their reputation so that more new clients are just begging them, please create another monstrosity for my corporation, or a government building in, say, Bazukistan. We want our government building to show that we are the most powerful and avant-garde government in the world.
Well, I have always thought that the RIBA should adopt the Carbuncle Cup, because the Carbuncle Cup is just fantastic, and it's just the ability to have like a Raspberry Award for architecture is just fantastic. And I think that should be a professional thing. I think the professional bodies around the world, the AIA, the RIBA, all the others, should have awards for bad buildings. And the sort of the professional embarrassment of being awarded one of those should be so significant that you can't possibly create something terrible.
I'm afraid that doesn't work. My friends in Scandinavia, they have the Turkey Award for the worst building, and they award it yearly to the worst building. And so far, none of the architects awardees have actually come to the ceremony to claim the award, which is not surprising. So, they have been awarding this for several years in Sweden. The RIBA should propose the Josef Mengele Award for inhuman experiments on people. But of course, it's a highly controversial thing. There is enough medical evidence to make this not such a crazy idea.
Well, one of the mechanisms that I have seen occasionally work to stop really bad buildings is the ability, this works in our country to some extent, the ability of high-ranking politicians to call in buildings. So normally our housing secretary or our planning secretary or whoever it is can call in the biggest buildings if they think that they need reviewing or if they think there's something wrong with them. And basically veto them or say, no, you need to go back and change it. And this has happened on a few occasions. And all that takes is one elected individual who's not normally an architect or a member of the architecture profession. Yes, they're a politician, but they've been elected. And if that existed at more levels, yes, you might still get some corruption, of course. But there might be more individuals who have the power to individually say, on certain schemes, whether it's mayors or anyone like that, no, this is not a good design. This does not reflect the values that we want in our city or our town. Go back to the drawing board, try again.
There are several things one can say about this. One is that I have hope in Nicholas Boy Smith being able to educate the political class to be able to take such decisions, because your average politician is totally confused and is pressured from both sides. On the one hand, you have one of our friends saying, listen, no, this is a horrible building. It's going to make people sick in it. Please, stop it. On the other hand, you have the press saying, this is a marvelous design by a very famous person, is going to really put the city on the map, or is going to be one of the great buildings of the 21st century, etc. So, the politician is not trained to make such decisions, and they have this tremendous pressure from both sides, and the biggest pressure comes from the negative side, because the negative side has all the money and all the resources, the public relations, saying Britain must be seen to be progressive in architecture, so we need to build this monstrosity.
Is there to some extent a typological problem, in the sense that in the past, like the number of buildings or the range of uses of buildings was fairly small? Like there's obviously a lot of housing, a lot of residential buildings, and then you had large public buildings like courthouses, I suppose banks, churches. Whereas these days you've got sort of out of town shopping centers, you've got stadiums, you've got airports, you've got car parks, you've got very high rise buildings because of density. You've got a lot more typologies, I suppose, large office buildings as well. A lot more typologies where perhaps it's more difficult to make those typologies beautiful. I always think if you said to Louis Sullivan, can you create one of your Chicago style buildings, but it's got to be 80 stories? Could he have done that beautifully? Is that kind of thing possible? Or could you, if you said to Frank Lloyd Wright, can you create a out of town shopping center that's not horrific? Does the nature of those things lead to make it more difficult, at the very least, to create architectural beauty?
The answer is no, very straight no. And you don't have to go back to Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. I think that I've just seen some pictures of your work. You're a practicing architect. I think that someone can hire you to build something, anything, shopping mall. And by applying humane design principles, you can make it a rather beautiful environment. It has to do with the geometry, the path structure, the spaces, the materials, the connectivity. You can make it as beautiful as possible, far, far more beautiful than what your average product is going to be. So it's not the typologies, it's not the it is the blank, the theoretical wasteland that we began this conversation with.
Yeah, wow.
The knowledge, the tools in which to create a humane, responsive environment has been gutted, has been thrown out. And this is what we have filled in. And so there is all this information now is available for a sensitive architect to apply to make something, rather beautiful.
Well, I hope more students will engage with that kind of thing. Weirdly, for me, it wasn't until the middle of my second year that I started to sort of question the orthodoxy and the status quo that I was being taught. And ironically, it was Pugin's Contrasts that reading that, where he's arguing for Gothic against classicism, that sort of set me on the path of thinking more about the theoretical basis of what the design principles taught in architectural schools are. Why don't we talk a little bit more about the actual architectural elements themselves on a more micro level? Do you want to take a 5-minute break and come back and do that?
Sure, yeah.
Right, so we are back. Let's go into a little more of the smaller scale kind of side of architecture and how it relates to your theories. One of the things that I've always found to be a very missing element from architecture, especially as it relates to the natural world, is fractals. Now, you talk a lot about fractals and fractal geometry in your work, and I think you refer to it often as structural order. Can you explain what is structural order and how does it fit into your theory and how does it relate to fractals and fractal geometry?
Yes, structural order is the geometrical side of healing design. And one of several components happens to be fractals. So fractals is not all of structural order. It is one component. A fractal is a structure or a visual or a physical structure that has substructure. So when you magnify it, you see more and more structure. The most mathematically pure fractals are self-similar. So you magnify it by, say, 3 times, and then it looks almost the same. And then you magnify it again by 3 times, which is 9 times. It looks almost the same. You magnify it again by 3 times, it looks almost the same. And you have the obvious examples of a fern leaf that obeys exactly this, or a cauliflower, or a Romanesco broccoli. And so these are the human lung, which you don't normally see, but you can look at a picture of the human lung, or cracks on clay, on a waterbed, a dry waterbed. So these are fractal structures. And when we look at nature, everything in nature has structure. The more you magnify, the more structure you see. So some of this is statistical fractals, namely when you magnify it by, say, 30 times, it doesn't look the same, but it's still wonderfully complex because things are happening. There's nothing empty. If there's something empty, there's nothing happening. It says not only is it dead from the biological point of view, but there's no structure there. So that is it's very rare to have something like that in nature, and certainly not in nothing that's alive. A living structure requires all these mechanisms that act on different levels of scale. So that's fractal structure. Of course, any architect listening to this will say, oh, well, that's absolute nonsense. We want purity. We want the whole wall of the building to be absolutely smooth and shiny. Why? It's non-fractal. The human brain evolved to connect with and interpret fractal structure. Such a huge non-fractal structure makes us feel uneasy. It's bad for our health, eventually. But, you know, then the architects, again, from day one, the architecture student is shown these images and say, this is beautiful. We have to build like this. Why? Well, there are books and books full of stupid explanations about ethics and the spirit of the age and modernism that's going to save the world. But all that is garbage. It does not undo the negative psychological reaction we have to the non-fractal structures.
What's the actual, while we're on that, what's the actual evidence base on that? Like in terms of what experiments have people done, what results have actually come up in terms of analyzing sort of the degree of fractality as it relates causally to psychological variables?
Yes, fractality. Well, just look at my latest paper with Nir Buras, Anna Brielman, and Richard Taylor, published in Urban Science, and we review 230 publications. So anyone who wants to go to the original experiments that show why we need fractal in order to connect can go to that. And that's just, you know, a latest paper that I happen to co-author. There are hundreds of studies that show that. And my co-author, Richard Taylor, happens to be one of the world's experts on fractals. You know, he did the fractal analysis of Jackson Pollock's paintings.
So there's, in terms of what people actually understand architecturally by fractal buildings, obviously there's self-similar examples, like I suppose like Jackson Pollock's paintings are like directly self-similar. I remember in a previous paper I used Gothic architecture because they sort of use the same Gothic arch at multiple scales. What are the best examples of good sort of high fractality architecture that exist? And what are the elements that if you're designing a building you have to think about to give it a higher degree of fractality?
This fractality.
Sorry.
No, just go by your gut instinct. You know, if you can get away from the modernist brainwashing, just go with your gut instinct. And paying attention to the tectonics will give you different scales because things happen at different scales. And then you can check those scales saying, well, is there something happening at 3 meters? Yes, because of the structure of this thing. Is there something happening at 1 meter? Maybe no. Well, let me introduce some ornament at 1 meter. Is there something happening at 30 centimeters? Yes, because, you know, the windowsill has to be. Is something happening at 1/3 of that, at 10 centimeters? Yes. Is there something happening at 3 centimeters? No. So let me introduce something, you know, like a molding, which incidentally is good, you know, to keep air currents from flowing in. So this is very approximate. What's important is to allow for the materials themselves to express the fractality, and then to have it sort of, once you're aware that it's good to have a complete fractal, to go in and put in the missing parts. Now, you notice that I'm giving a definition of ornamentation. If there is a missing scale at 3 centimeters, so you go in and ornament that, and you create the scale by ornament. You know, it is not needed for the tectonics. However, when we look at the traditional buildings, nobody thought this way. The 3 centimeters was there because you needed that. You needed that trim in the corner.
Well, this, I guess, is the one of the issues. Is a lot of people might say, well, why would I put something extra there that doesn't have a function when it's unnecessary? Like I don't like a lot of traditional building systems might have so-called ornamental elements that were actually there because they were practical or functional. Whereas these days, you can clad everything in and it can be super smooth. I'm playing devil's advocate, of course. Why? And obviously, and they would say, oh, well, it's going to be more expensive. Like, oh, you're going to turn your nice smooth wall with a single cladding across the whole thing, and you're going to start introducing all these little bits, and they're all fiddly, and your labor costs are going to go up, and la. And why should I pay more when there's no direct benefit to me? How would you answer that?
Yes, let me demolish your devil's advocate argument. First of all, it is absolutely necessary because the human brain requires a fractal for well-being. Unconsciously, we feel the lack of a certain scale in a structure. So in the long term, that could make us uneasy and could lead to a worsening health. So it is the architect's argument is totally false. It is not, it is something is functional if it's good for your health, if it's good for the body, if it's good for the user. So you need the fractal scales because of human health. Now, with the second part of the argument, which you told me, which is the usual false argument, is that it's going to cost more. Well, today we can mass produce anything we want. It's not going to cost more. It actually costs more to insist on some ridiculous minimalist precision in order to come up to a joint with a window. It's far cheaper to have less of tolerance and then to put a scale there, which is just a trim. It cuts down costs.
Yeah, I always think this. There's a reason why cornices and skirtings and all these kind of things exist, because you do things really roughly and then you stick something over the top that covers up the gap. And as you say, it's that the extra degree of precision required to not have that covering and not have that tolerance, it exceeds the additional cost of installing the covering or whatever it is, yeah. So but it's difficult to make that argument because people can say, oh, well, you labor this cost and that cost per hour and this cost per square meter and and we can't quantify the psychological benefit. You can't say, oh, you're meeting this building regulation and that building regulation because you've met these dimensions or whatever it is. Like there's not a psychological well-being equivalent of that. Like it's a much softer thing to measure.
Well, my dear Bruce, we have several decades of misinformation to work against because all of the misleading information on construction detail is codified into the system. So people are shocked to hear the argument I just made to you, that we need a particular scale, even if it's ornamental, for a human well-being. But then who are we building for? Are we building for an antiquated set of building codes, or are we building for the well-being of the individual and the user? It's time for us to totally revise the way we see the function of a building. The function of a building is for the health of the user. If that point can go across, we would have solved a lot of questions.
Yeah, well, the idea that part of the function of a building is psychological as well as just practical is so alien to a lot of people, including especially architects. The idea that it should have that function, not only on an individual level, but on an urban level. Exactly. That you have the sort of, as people often say, architecture is the only art you can't avoid. Because you can't, if you're walking down a street, you can't not see a building. Or if you have to go into a particular building for whatever reason, you can't avoid being affected by that art, if you call it art. So therefore, it has a sort of, on a more morals and philosophical level, it has a public duty to act in the general public well-being. Now, you might argue that if you're a millionaire and you want to build a crazy house that's completely out of view of anyone else, that you don't have that right. But most buildings aren't like that. Most buildings are in an urban context and therefore they have a duty, I think, at least, to contribute to the urban realm in a sustainable and holistic, I suppose, if I can bring that word in, way.
Yes, wonderfully summarized. Thank you, Bruce.
Well, I'm not sure that many architects necessarily think that way, or that it's hard to make that argument to your client when you can't very easily quantify the variables that you're trying to put across to them. Like it's a difficult argument to make to your client to say, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, when they're trying to do cost saving on their building for whatever reason.
No, but wait a minute. That was true 20 years ago. Today, there is so much published information that you can summarize for a client and convince a client. So the situation has changed drastically, largely as a result of the efforts of my colleagues and friends and other people who are working in the same area, whom I not necessarily know directly. There's a huge amount of data gathering and publication in accessible language. So what used to be stuck and archived in experimental psychology journals and in the medical literature, we have taken, and other colleagues of mine have taken and have translated into architectural language, and now it's available. Of course, the architectural establishment has no clue about this, but that's another matter. You want to talk to the client. There's enough, overwhelmingly enough information to convince the client of the well-being of the user of the building, and the client who pays for the building should be concerned with the well-being. Say if it's a bank, they will want the people working inside this building to feel healthy. They will want the bank client who has to approach the building, say in a pedestrian way, to be able to see the entrance and find the entrance welcoming. Otherwise, it is stress-inducing just to approach the building. Unless, as some architects do, we envision a dystopian world where you just drive to a building, enter with your car, park in the garage, and then go and do your business there. That's a totally dystopian world, which is unfortunately being built all over the world today. But it's not the kind of world I want to live in.
Well, going back to slightly contradict my own point from earlier about the contrast between sort of so-called traditionalism and modernism and there not being a middle ground, I have been encouraged to see that there is, especially at the smaller scale around like small housing schemes and that kind of thing, and things like small schools, there is more of a merging of some more, I guess, holistic or more traditional elements of architecture with a modernist aesthetic or modern aesthetic in a sort of vernacular way. You might call it vernacular modernism, I suppose. And that there is that beginning of emerging, I guess, as a necessity of it being more client focused or less showy, in the sense it's not a star architect project. It's not the ego thing you mentioned earlier. It's not the power play. It's just that there's a hangover from small architect X who has been taught the way they've been taught, and they therefore design some houses or a school or something in a particular way. But I have seen more architects begin to use more ornamental elements, even within modern buildings, which is encouraging. But I don't sense that they really understand why it is they're doing that, or the extent to which they should be doing it to make their buildings so much better.
What you say is a phenomenon, and we cannot really discuss it without visuals. But of course, we're just chatting. We don't have visuals. However, I want to raise the warning flag in that in order to achieve a holistic architecture, you need to achieve visual and tectonic coherence. It's impossible if you have modernist visual elements which try to undo holism and coherence and put them together with more traditional elements that try to achieve holistic architecture. The two are opposite, they're opposing each other. You will always get the disjointed, the result will be disjointed and trying to tear itself apart. And unfortunately, architects today are not trained in order to create a holistic architecture. So even though they may introduce a ornament, the ornament will look like it's stuck on and ridiculous. And it's very, very unfortunate because that gives the so-called architecture critics a target to say, look, this architect tried to put ornament and it looks stupid. Well, perhaps it does look stupid because the poor architect was not trained in holistic design and the design techniques that my friends and I, beginning from Alexander and before that, have developed, where you can really create coherence so that you don't notice something sticking out. Okay, and you don't have to go even very far back, to contemporary mismatch design to find that even in historical design, you have a wonderful Romanesque church. Okay, and then some cardinal went and put some Rococo additions. Well, they stick out like a sore thumb. It's each individual piece is beautiful, but it's not holistic because whoever did this ruined the original cohesion, should have left it alone and introduced something that this doesn't go with the remainder.
Yeah, well, going back to structural order, part of it else you mentioned was paired contrasting elements on a small scale and how that fits into sort of functional ornament or ornament that works well. And the best example for me for this is when you get like an entrance to a cathedral or something, and you have the multiple layers of stonework that go back, and you'll get one that's highly banded, and then there'll be a plain one, and then there'll be one that's highly ornamented in a different way, and then a plain one, and then there's another one that's ornamented in a completely different way, and then there's a plain one. And because there's that interaction, there's that alternating, ornamented versus less ornamented, more ornamented, less ornamented, more ornamented, that creates a sense of ornament that's much better and much more functional and doesn't sort of blend. As you said, it doesn't feel stuck on, it feels part of it. How practically do people apply that to buildings they put in today, would you say?
Not at all, unless they have trained their intuition very well. But most architects have their intuition totally ruined after finishing architecture school. Now, what you mentioned is part of the toolkit that combines my results with Christoph Alexander's 15 fundamental properties, which are geometrical properties. And one of these geometrical properties is the alternating repetition, which is exactly, it fits what you described. So this is just a rhythm on the same scale, translational symmetry with alternation. This is part of a toolbox. So as I mentioned earlier, structural order has fractals as one component. Then you have nested symmetries, and then you have other things like you have the fractals that go with the scaling, like the nested arches is part of a fractal, but it's not it is more of a self-similarity. And then you have the alternating repetition, which is part of translational symmetry, but you also have rotational symmetry and reflectional symmetries. And the best effect is done by nesting all these symmetries together in a way that is coherent. So the end result has to be absolutely coherent. And then you also have the vertical axis, not for any mathematical reason, but because of our sensor. Our inner ear senses the vertical axis because of the gravity, and we need to refer to the vertical axis. It's biology, it's not mathematics. So, but when you design something, you use the mathematics of the vertical axis. How many architects you see who deliberately violate the vertical axis, who do something slanted? Why do they do that? It is because they're sadistic psychopaths. I'm sorry to say that, but it is going against the human unconscious responses to forms that create anxiety. This is deliberate creation of anxiety, and I have no excuse for that. I cannot accept any possible excuse.
Well, it's difficult. I imagine I'm thinking of my time back as a student, as an undergraduate and a postgrad. In postgrad, it's easier because you have more freedom. But as an undergrad, it often feels quite difficult to go against what your professors are saying, not least because you don't really have the basis or the knowledge on which to argue against what they're saying or offer alternative opinions. How would you recommend that your typical undergraduate architecture student or postgrad goes about teaching themselves the kinds of things that they need to know to create sort of beautiful, holistic architecture?
Yes, fortunately, I have the solution right here. I taught a course, Unified Architectural Theory, twice. And the second time, I put it all online. So that is available, posted online, including 10 video lectures, and all the material is free online. So any architect, student, undergraduate or postgraduate or practicing architect anywhere around the world can follow this course free online and teach themselves. It so happens that several universities in India are going to actually assign this to universities and teach it with lecturers starting in a few weeks for credit. But this is available free online, not for credit.
Mm. So I think another thing I'd say is I found it quite difficult that there's, when you're doing things like technical details, there's a whole library of late 20th century modernist technical details out there, but there's very few using contemporary materials or more, at least more up-to-date materials of a non-modernist style. And I remember finding a book, Victorian book on brickwork detailing, and effectively an equivalent to the modern technical detailing books, but from the Victorian period, which was incredibly useful, but it was quite difficult to translate the building technologies of that time into the building technologies of today, whilst retaining all of the interest in the ornament and the ways they've done it and the ways things were detailed. So are there particular, I guess, buildings or particular books that people can study to learn the sort of technical and detailing and I suppose ornamenting knowledge that they need to know to create the sort of beautiful and holistic buildings?
I don't think so. What you have now are my books, which are they're written by mathematical physicists, so you're not going to get brick detailing. You have Christopher Alexander's books, which cover how he solved some problems using contemporary materials to create ornament for today. So especially volume 3 of The Nature of Order is hands-on building and including ornament. And his experiments, he did many experiments in ornament. So, you know, don't come to me for that, but that does exist. And when you dig into people who have worked and followed Alexander, you see that there's a tremendous inventiveness in these architects who are not well known, but they have done wonderful buildings, and all under the radar, of course, because they're marginalized by the mainstream. So as far as books, I would say this Christopher Alexander's The Nature of Order, Volume 3. However, students who want to learn that, how to do that today, should look at contemporary architects who are flying under the radar.
Are there any names in particular or any architects you know of that are doing this kind of work that people should look at?
I'm reluctant to name names, but you have on the one hand, one group of Alexandrian architects, many in the United States and some in Europe, and they can be located through the Building Beauty program, which teaches Alexander's books to online classes. And we have our friends, the classical architects, of which you have many in the UK. And even if you don't want to learn to design classical buildings, they are concerned with the tectonics and the small scale creation of ornament. And they don't all use carved stone because it's so expensive. Many of them have worked out how to create very nice ornament using contemporary materials with very cheap industrial methods that look very nice and make a building affordable.
Mm. So you know, I'm in two minds about the classicism, because having come from a Puginite inspiration, my love of Gothic and my general hatred of classicism is conflicting in my mind between my love of ornament versus my distaste of minimalism. So it's
you cannot be prejudiced. You asked me a specific question, and I gave you a specific answer. traditional architects who practice today faced exactly the problem that you mentioned: how to create something wonderful and adaptive using contemporary materials, or innovative ways of using traditional materials in ways that are not so extremely prohibitively expensive. So those practitioners have solved some of the problems that you refer to, and I'm just referring you back to them.
Yeah, no, I think it's good, definitely good to study it in more detail. In terms of you mentioned biophilic design as part of your theory. I'm massively interested, as I said, in biophilic design in the sense of biointegration and bioreceptivity, i.e., the ability of buildings to become ecosystems and become structures for nature and for local wildlife, effectively, whether that's plant-based or animal-based. To me, there's a big opportunity within the use of ornament to do it in such a way that maximizes the surface area of a building, and also provides habitat to natural systems, plants, etc., to generally increase urban greening without the need for very, very intricate, quite fragile systems like green walls. Do you think that's part of the solution for biophilic design, or is it practically not going to work that well and you just need to stick to more conventional ways of doing biophilic design?
My answer to your statement is yes, but it is a second order effect. Let me explain what I mean. Biophilic design means that you create the building itself so that it connects with the human user in the same way that the human user connects to a natural environment by biological organisms. So you need to have the geometry of the actual inanimate materials mimic the mathematics of biological organisms, which includes what we have discussed prior to this: the fractals, the nested symmetries, and the vertical axis, et cetera. Added to that, the actual presence of plants, if possible, and that gives you a biophilic building. Now, the second order effect is that once you achieve the biophilic building, you're in a state of mind that you want to connect to the nature outside, and then you can green it up and get an effective solution. And I want to contrast this with the false solution where a modernist architect will take a concrete cube and then put a roof garden on top. It doesn't work. It is jarring. Okay, you can make it work. It's extremely expensive, but it is philosophically contradictory, because you have the building made from the materials in a totally anti-biophilic way, and then you add some green on it. Well, it is a contradictory philosophy. The way you explain it works, because it is you have all the forces acting in the same direction to create something that is adaptive to its environment, and that's really the only sustainable solution long term.
Mm. And moving into the sort of the weeds of the theory on that, and kind of relates to the same thing. You mentioned entropy in your book, and I've sort of tried to tie in how entropy relates on a sort of more very fundamental philosophical level to architecture. How, first of all, does entropy play into your architectural theory? What is it, for people who don't know what it is, for a start, and how does it factor into your architectural theory?
Entropy is disorder, and for architecture, we'll say it's visual disorder. So you take a box of toothpicks and throw them on the floor, and you have a total entropy because they're randomly aligned. If you carefully align them to make some sort of pattern, then you are reducing the entropy. And at the same time, you're creating a pattern. You're introducing symmetries, connectivity. That's what architecture is. Now, some architects deliberately break up the form This is deconstructivism. You break up the form and by injecting randomness for no good reason except for visual shock. So that's entropy being embedded into an architectural design, into a building. The human mind reacts very negatively. It's stressed by seeing this entropy embodied into form. So all the tools of design that I have alluded to create a humanly adaptive design are really methods of reducing the entropy, the visual entropy.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we mentioned politics and stuff earlier. I think there's a philosophical divide as well, where there's an inclination, I think, in the kind of things that I think you and I both believe, where the desire to order things is seen as a good thing. Whereas philosophically, a lot of architects see excess order as a bad thing, and there has to be a sort of level of randomness or chaos, and that's more desirable somehow. And that I don't know entirely where that comes from, but it seems to me quite a damaging thought that there has to be a level of disorder in buildings, and that tends to, given the fact that a building has to be extremely ordered to be built, it always manifests itself on a sort of large formal level. I think Herzog and de Meuron are the worst offenders for me on this, where you end up with a building that's clearly visually attempting to be disordered, but ultimately it has to be built somehow, and therefore it ends up looking very artificial disorder rather than actual sort of organic disorder, I suppose.
I think what you're referring to is a manifestation of the ignorance of architects about disorder and order. In order to create a building, you have to use certain physical materials that have to be ordered. You may play tricks, sort of sadistic tricks, and use materials to embed visual disorder into a building. For what reason? It's bad for the user's psychological health. It's just a trick. But such tricks are the currency of contemporary architecture. All the worst and most harmful tricks of architecture, going back to the Bauhaus, have attached to them explanations that are totally stupid and spurious. So there is no trick that creates horrible inhuman buildings that doesn't have an explanation attached to it. And architects, are inventive in their explanations. If they would only use their intelligence and inventiveness to create humanly appropriate buildings, we would have a much better world.
Well, let's end on a subject that provides a large part of the income base for most architects, which is retrofit. What is given the amount that has been built now, especially in the late 20th century, the urban expansion, and I suppose this is more of an issue in places where, like the US, where you are, than where I am, where a lot of the housing stock is sort of Victorian or Georgian. But given the amount that has been built in the late 20th century, what is the right philosophy for retrofitting those sorts of buildings? Like, say you're not either whether you're a giant master planner and you're putting in a new, or a council, I suppose, and putting in large blocks within urban areas, or even if you're an individual architect who's asked to do an extension on the back of a late 20th century house of some kind. You see a million examples of that where they've gone full contrast. They've gone, say it's a brick building, they've done some, I don't know, angular metal thing, or something that's very, very different in some visual ways, both formally and materially, to the building that it's next to. That's one philosophy. Someone like Voisey or Lutyens, working in the early 20th century, would have done completely the opposite philosophy, and they would have made it almost completely impossible to tell which bit of the building was old and which bit was new. What is the appropriate philosophy, do you think, for retrofitting holistic, beautiful extensions and additional architectural elements onto a predominantly modernist architectural built environment?
I will answer your question, but I will throw out the premise that you introduced. I would say that someone who is charged with a retrofit should take my online course or listen to my online course to get a basis of feeling for what is appropriate and what is adaptive, and then face the existing structure to see how far the existing structure can be changed with additions or renovations according to the budget available. And I think 85% of the existing structures can be improved, vastly improved, with very minimal interventions. There are certain geometries that are just too hideous and too inhuman, and those have to be bulldozed. But those tend to be the exceptions. And I mean minimal interventions like coat of paint or put a frame around the window.
It does always amaze me how many new houses or modernist aesthetic, the sort of vernacular modernism, how they all have no window surrounds at all. How you have this sort of the either brick or often slip brick facades that cut into the window, and there's no surround, there's no nothing, and same on the doors, obviously. There's no visual break. It's like a hole has been just punched through the visual fabric, which is deliberate, obviously, because that's the aesthetic.
Very deliberate. Yes, very deliberate to create anxiety by eliminating the fractal.
I don't dismiss that it instills anxiety, but I wouldn't suggest that your average architect thinks of it that way when they're doing it.
Does your low-level mafia operative think they're doing something wrong by going and bullying a shopkeeper to take the monthly extortion? It's part of business, okay? So architects have been trained through the architecture school that, this cutout window is the way to do it. Because why? Because, it goes back to the Bauhaus. This is good. So, they do it without thinking.
Mm.
I'm trying to raise the awareness level of our society that this induces anxiety. And as we talked earlier, it increases building costs because you don't have the frame, you don't have the that little trim. And going back to the theoretical rantings of the modernist architects, that were looking for the sealant between the glass and the wall, the perfect sealant to create this pure form. That's totally ridiculous. There is no perfect sealant. If you would only use a frame and a trim, you don't need this magical sealant, which still, it doesn't work.
Yeah, and it doesn't last as well. I think this is one of the things. If you're going to create a sustainable building that lasts a good amount of time and can be retrofitted later on or reused in a different way, you don't want to create a building where all the seals are going to break after 20 years or all the like delicate materials or delicate cladding you put on has to be replaced after 30 or 40 years. That's not sustainable.
We have been building unsustainably for a century. Traditional building is far, far more sustainable. We don't want to admit it. All the nonsense written about sustainability in the press is totally misleading. They take an unsustainable typology like the glass skyscraper, and then they put double panes on it. It decreases the energy use, by 3%. That's stupidity. You have something that's basically unsustainable and energy wasting. It cannot be fixed. We had the techniques earlier, and we threw them away.
Yeah, well, I think that's why it's so important to study the sort of techniques that are used in a more passive way and in more traditional architecture. Because just because you study something doesn't mean you have to do it exactly the same way. Like you wouldn't, just because you're studying the old masters' paintings doesn't mean you're necessarily going to do something that looks exactly the same. Like you can take old technologies or old ideas and you can apply them in new ways. but you just need to get past this idea that somehow it's taboo to study old buildings.
Yes, 1 second, Bruce. If you study all master paintings until they seep into you, and then you're a painter, then you output something that has a certain level of beauty without copying them. The same thing, if you're an architect and you study the traditional techniques that lead to feeling of well-being, then you create something totally innovative today that has the same feeling of well-being from it. And you can use any materials you want, anything that's available, save costs, use new technology. But you put your finger on it. There's the taboo. If you don't break the taboo, you will always be stuck in this modernist cult world that you say, I cannot put a frame on my window. I cannot paint the inside of my house. It has to look gray. Or an important building, an art museum has to have this horrible concrete, the raw concrete surface on it. It's a taboo.
It's interesting to me how many more times postmodernism seems to be popping up these days, almost as a reaction to modernism, but in the sense that no one really knows what else to do, so let's just revive the 1980s. And it's kind of comical.
Well, yeah, no. What you say is tragic, because the architectural cult is so insular, so stuck within themselves, they're unable to look across the fence. So in order to react to what's obviously inhuman, which is the high style modernism, they go to the postmodernism, which is totally stupid and silly. But there are solutions out there. Just look over the fence. You have humane architecture. Look at the favelas around the world, the slums around the world. These people without architectural training are creating human environments with junk materials. Okay, learn from these people. They know more than your star architects. And they can find some, discarded paint, and they paint their houses and they ornament their houses. And these are people on the very edge of being able to stay alive. And they create wonderful spaces with all these terrible problems that they have. Architects, open your eyes. Just look at the intrinsic architectural talents of the human animal. That those architectural talents are suppressed and destroyed through architecture school by imprinting a set of images that are totally inhuman. That's why it's so difficult for architects to do what you just mentioned a few minutes ago, to retrofit something that's ugly. Well, it should be easy to someone. How do I retrofit this? Make it prettier. Well, a real trained architect cannot take those steps, cannot imagine this because of the mental block.
Let's talk about isms. We have modernism. We have postmodernism. I suppose we have traditionalism as a catch-all term. Patrick Schumacher, who I talked to a couple of years ago, has tried to introduce parametricism. And you can argue about the pros and cons of that. I think there's some good things, there's a lot of bad things. Do we need another ism? Will there be another ism? When we're having this conversation in the year 2100, and we're looking back at the history of early 21st century architecture, what's going to be the ism after modernism and postmodernism?
I don't know. I have an answer to that. These labels are created from within the architectural cult. They don't represent what humanity is like, or what humanity needs in the built environment. What humanity needs in the built environment is just adaptive design, adaptive construction, human scale cities. That are neurologically responsive. There should be no ism here. But I can very well see the little clique of the top architectural establishments creating another ism just to continue their hegemony on the profession. I don't have much hope.
Well, it seems to me that the strong philosophical base of early modernism, whether good or bad, seems to have petered out, and people have lost that yearning for something really philosophically strong. There's no real movement. It's just sort of what was modernism is just ticking over and sort of fading in various directions depending on where you are. And that, like, for me, the word holistic is the best word that to encompass what it is that we need architecture to be moving forward. And that's sort of a word that's has associations which aren't always positive, but I think can be sort of reclaimed in the sense that it's meant to mean. But I guess it depends what sort of direction you're trying to take architecture in. The sustainable is obviously the word that's most in vogue, quite rightly, in my opinion, and it's good that sustainability is becoming more important. But as long as you don't sort of use it with perverse incentives.
The word sustainable is totally abused. It's a joke. It's so-called sustainable buildings are a joke. You know, they improve performance by 3%. It's ridiculous. On the other hand, I think, you know, you're a young architect. You coin the new ism. You know, it's up to young architects to coin the new ism. You know, and go for it. You know what the problems are. You know what the solutions are. You need holism. You need adaptation to the neurological responses of the human body, which, as you correctly pointed out, is totally ignored by the architectural establishment. This is the new thing. If architecture is going to survive, no, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you'll get another stupid, superficial ism, and then the media will take off with that, and we will continue to have inhuman architecture for another 100 years. There is no guarantee that people will wake up from their occult-induced stupidity and manipulation. You know, people are easily manipulated, and unfortunately, the most intelligent people are the worst offenders because they get fanatical about supporting the cult.
Mm. Well,
I'm not optimistic. You know, I'm older than you, and I'm not optimistic at all.
Well, I try to be optimistic. I try to. I get various signals one way or the other as to whether it's justified to be optimistic, but I don't know. I'm hopeful that there's enough of a movement in enough areas that coincide enough with the principles that we're talking about that the momentum will build up and things will start to change. But maybe I'm naive.
No, I hope you're right. And it needs young people like you to be optimistic. And I, for one, can tell you that you would not be doing what you're doing now, say 30 years ago. It would have been impossible.
In what sense?
You would have been censored.
Oh, I see.
the world was not ready. Okay, maybe people don't like what you are saying now. And I have watched your other interviews. You are bringing ideas to the table to change architecture for the better. You would not be allowed to do that 30 years ago. The establishment was not ready to allow you to do that, or you may have, done it and you would be totally marginalized. So the time is ripe now for a change, and you have come from inside the establishment, not like me. I came from mathematical physics, from way from the outside. You have come from the inside, and you have realized the need for a change. So this is a big plus that I see. So you have cause for optimism.
Well, I'll try to stay optimistic. All right. Well, thank you very much, Nikos. It's been wonderful talking to you. I would encourage everybody to read all of your books, but especially my favorite one, which is A Theory of Architecture. And of course, we have the newest edition or revised version of a pattern language, a new pattern language for growing regions. Do you want to say anything else about that?
Yes. That is not a revised version. It is 80 additional patterns to complement the original 235 patterns of Christopher's pattern language. And good news for all the listeners of this program, the new pattern language, thanks to the chief author, Michael Mahaffey, is free on the internet. So, you buy the book only if you want to have it handy, which I strongly recommend, but it is free on the internet, which follows our philosophy of of open access to give people access to these design tools.
Mm. Yeah, well, hopefully people will read those and many other books and study the old masters, both artistic and architectural, and hopefully produce some beautiful holistic buildings moving into the future. So, Nikos, thank you very much for your time, and it's been wonderful to talk to you, and hope to hear from you again soon.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks a lot.